This is JadeCast, your gateway to traditional martial arts and Chinese culture. Brought to you by your host, Shifu Jonathan Bluestein.
I'm here today with Jonathan Bluestein, who is a martial artist and author who has some interesting questions for me about various things and contacted me about a research project of his. So, Jonathan, why don't we start by you telling us sort of who you are, what you're interested in, and why you needed to pick my brains.
Yes, thank you very much for having me today, Guy. And this conversation is certainly long overdue. We are looking to discuss certain similarities and differences between the traditional Chinese martial arts, the field of practice and study from which I come from, and traditional European martial arts, both in, I suppose, medieval and Renaissance times, as well as in our everyday lives today. My background is in traditional Oriental martial arts in general. I did begin with Western boxing, but quickly transitioned into Okinawan karate and eventually ended up practicing and teaching the traditional Chinese martial arts. I've had 5 teachers, just briefly. My main teachers are Shifu Nitzan Oren, my late Shigong teacher's teacher, Master Zhou Jingxuan from Tianjin, Sifu Sapir Tal, Shifu Stephen Jakovitz, and Shifu Brian Ho. In our tradition, mentioning one's teachers is an important cultural facet. Respect for one's teachers is an integral part of the tradition itself, is something maybe we can discuss later. And the martial arts, I studied primarily the Chinese martial arts are Xin Yi Quan, Pi Gua Zhang, Jukulum Sovereign Mantis, a little bit of Ba Gua Zhang, and the Li family system of traditional Shaolin. I've been teaching for about a decade. I've been practicing martial arts for about 18 years. And beyond the martial arts, as Guy mentioned, I am an author. I've written a number of books on the martial arts as well as other topics. And I'm a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine.
Okay, pretty comprehensive. Now, I think maybe the first thing that will leap out at us is that in historical martial arts, as we know them, it is deplorably unlikely that any given person will actually mention their teachers. And as a teacher, I've often found that to be a little bit annoying. Like, for God's sake, tell us where you got your stuff from. But it basically comes down to the historical martial arts as we are doing them. When we use the term historical martial arts, we're basically referring to martial arts that have been recreated from textual sources from bygone periods, which means there is no living tradition at all. So, for example, if we're doing early 15th century knightly combat, we're doing it from books written in the early 15th century, and there is no lineage to draw on. Now, that said, if there is a sort of a development of European swordsmanship from, very long ago, and we can trace a development from like the 16th century sword play into the use of the rapier, into the use of the small sword, and from the small sword into what became known as classical fencing, and from classical fencing into modern sport fencing. So the closest thing we really have is some of the lineages of classical fencing that date back to the 19th century. And you could say that the inheritors of the European martial arts, certainly the sword arts, would be the sport fencers, who are not doing a martial art at all, right? And they'll be the first to say, this is a competitive sport. This is not supposed to be how you win a sword fight in real life. So there is a fundamental difference in where we're coming from. So, I'm mostly known for my research into specific historical masters. And yeah, I now have some of my students have students who have students. So I guess if this was a Chinese tradition, I'd be some sort of, I don't know, Sipa or something like that.
Shigong is the teacher of the Shifu.
Okay, but there's another generation past that as well.
Yeah, yes, there's additional ones. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I'll be one of them, right?
Yes.
But because there's no expectation of the student preserving the master's tradition, right? The student in our activity is their job is to basically do more research, find out new things, and in many cases prove their teacher wrong. Right? It's much closer to, for example, science than it is to in terms of the way lineage works. Like if you trained under Richard Feynman in physics, that's super cool and it kind of means something, but you're only going to get a Nobel Prize by doing something that Feynman couldn't. Do you see what I mean?
Certainly, and a tad adversarial in the transmission between generations.
I wouldn't call it adversarial. I would call it more developmental. I mean,
Okay.
it's like having kids, right? I can hear that you have children. I have children as well. And, one of these days, see, at the moment, I know more than my children on practically every topic. Not every topic, because now my eldest is now doing some chemistry and biology at school that I don't know. So she's passed me in the chemistry department already. But there will be a time when, like, my youngest wants to become a doctor. Fairly quickly, when she goes to med school, if she goes to med school, she's 14, so there's a way to go. Fairly quickly after she gets to med school, she's going to know a lot more about medicine than I do, right? And that's good. That's what parents want, right? We want our children to surpass us in whatever areas they're interested in. And so that's closer to how I feel about my students. Like when one of my students brings out a book, which or produces some research or teaches a seminar or whatever, and is doing their own thing using the training I've given them, but building on it rather than repeating it. That's a good thing because it develops the art. It makes the art broader and deeper.
Okay, so I would like to touch on several differences and similarities that
Sure.
you just mentioned, Guy. One is that we have two types of lineages in the traditional Chinese martial arts. The typical one is indeed a transmission from teacher to student, which may have been going on for thousands of years, albeit the case being that this is not typically documented past a few generations. Because what had happened...
Okay, so hang on a second. If you claim a lineage going back thousands of years, surely you have to be able to document that to claim it.
That's exactly one of the problems here, because no extant lineage of a traditional Chinese martial art can prove that it has been practiced for thousands of years.
Right.
The evidence is anecdotal, either by stories or by the fact that we do have paintings and technique descriptions in books, not necessarily manuals even, that indicate that very similar things were already there, say, 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. We know that it's been around because it's been a consistent transmission, but they can't prove it. The farthest that I know that the Chinese martial art can prove and trace its roots would be around 400 to 500 years ago. And
Right.
that is quite rare. The
And
majority of styles...
that's comparable to what we can trace, not lineages, but these people were trained with those people who trained with those people going back to about 1380, something like that. That's about as far back as, but the art that we're talking about has changed radically in the intervening hundreds of years, right? So there's no sense of that, the arts themselves being maintained down the generations. They've always been changed because European martial arts generally are very technologically driven. So armor changed radically in the late 14th century, and so the martial arts changed to accommodate them. Then gunpowder became massively important from the middle of the 15th century onwards, so the martial arts changed to accommodate them, and so it goes.
Exactly.
So
I would say the majority of traditional Chinese martial arts can only say they go back around 150 to 250 years. So we would actually refer to them as rather young styles. They haven't been around for very long. As a matter of fact, most of the popular styles in the world today, the majority of them being Japanese martial arts and their derivatives have not been around for more than a century in their modern forms, right?
Right. Judo, Aikido, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. So the majority of Chinese styles have documented lineages. They go back a few generations, typically anywhere between 3 and 10 generations, and then prior to that, it's mostly myth and storytelling and anecdotal. But there are also a handful of styles nowadays which have been recreated from manuals, and that is a very new thing. It's been going on for the past 20 years. So the Chinese, in parallel with the Europeans, have been doing something very similar. And the reason for this is attempting to bring about extinct traditions that were once quite noteworthy and historically important. So
that's what we're doing.
Exactly. So military spear traditions and sword traditions. For example, there's a very famous Chinese general by the name of Qi Jiguang, who fought both in Korea, what is now the area of Korea, as well as on the coastal plains of China against the Japanese pirates. So there's actually a period with massive Japanese pirate excursions against the coastal settlements of China. And that was a big thing. The Chinese-Japanese feud is much older than the Second World War. And during that time, Qi Jiguang is the general who's said to have fended off the pirates, and that is documented in official imperial history books. And one of the weapons utilized by the troops of Qi Jiguang is the Miao Dao. Miao Dao is a longsword comparable with what is today the Japanese Nodachi or Odachi. So it is a katana-like weapon, somewhat different in the construction of the handle, because the Chinese did not have the same type of wrap around the handles as the Japanese do. They preferred using plain wooden handles. Mm-hmm. So the grain of the wood would be what your palm would rub against and then keep the sword in hand, rather than this very rough grip that the Japanese are using. And the sword was around the length of 135 centimeters, depending on which is quite long.
Yeah, it's about the same as a European longsword, generally. I mean, they vary hugely in length, but yeah.
Exactly. I mean, so there's variation.
My favorite longsword is about 140.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So of course that will depend on one's height. For my height, I'm 168 centimeters. I'm 5'6". So for me, an optimal Miao Dao is around 135 centimeters. Right. But if I was a tad taller, then 140 is better. And they were up to 2 meters long, but these were rare. Yeah,
that's a beast.
Rare. Yes. There are historical examples both in written documentation as well as in paintings. And paintings of the Miao Dao.
We have swords like that called montante and spadone, or zweihanders. So like really big, sort of 5 foot long sort of thing.
So the difference being, I think the montante and the long swords were around for a very long time, while the Miao Dao actually was primarily utilized for a very brief period in Chinese history and then sort of disappeared. It was kept in very small, scarce traditions within the Chinese martial arts. But because those lineages were so few and in between, very few people in China preserved the type of practice. A lot of people who were not privy to learn from these particular lineages recreated a lot of Miao Dao practice and content from the traditional manuals, which were actually quite detailed. They were at least as detailed as the good manuals you have from medieval period.
See, that's something I'm curious about. Like these historical sources, it is quite difficult to find historical sources that have sufficient information in one source that you can actually recreate the system from that, because usually they're not written to enable that. They're written as a record for someone who already knows it, or as a way of a fencing master getting more business, rather than sort of for posterity to preserve the entirety of the art in a way such that it can be recreated. So tell us a bit about your research project. Like, what you initially contacted me through a mutual friend. What is your actual research project?
Well, currently, I'm in the midst of working on a book called Martial Arts Politics Explained.
That is a bold title.
Oh, it is. Martial Arts Politics Explained. I think the subtitle is Culture, History, and Comedy.
Okay.
Cultural history. Because where we have martial arts politics, there's going to be a lot of drama and there's going to be a lot of comedy as well.
That is true in every area of martial arts I've ever encountered.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So when one seeks to explain how politics work in the martial arts, where I started the book is with exploring the different types of martial arts schools. So all over the world, we have certain modalities which are quite common. We have the sports club,
yep,
which can be, I subdivided it into two categories. Generally speaking, you have the stable and you have the gym. A stable is simply a martial arts sports club that's more geared towards competition, so competitors make the majority of people there. And the gym is a lay people sports club. There might be a few competitors, but most people are not professional athletes.
That's a really useful distinction. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we see that in historical martial arts, historical martial arts clubs. Those that are basically sports clubs are either stables or gyms. You're right. Interesting. I've not thought of it that way.
Yeah, it took me a while to get to it. I began writing the book, and then it dawned on me. And the word stable, I actually borrowed from the sumo stables of Japan.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So this is a Japanese term because they figured those sumo warriors were essentially groomed similar to how they would groom professional horses, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And modern F1. Formula One clubs or companies are often referred to as stables.
Oh, that's very interesting. Yes, and the Formula One drivers, people who are not in the know, are actually top athletes, and they do a whole lot more than simply drive those cars. One of the things I know they do mid-range competitive running. They don't actually compete, but they run at a competitive level in order to build the stamina and the bodily strength required for the races. Yep.
Okay, so you've got the sports clubs, which are stables, gyms. What's the other?
Yeah, so the other ones would be the traditional dojo or dojang. Dojo is the Japanese tradition. The dojang is an equivalent Korean tradition, which is quite close to it. You got the wugwan. Wugwan is the Mandarin term for the martial hall, literally martial hall. In the West, there are a lot of Cantonese-speaking Chinese, so a lot of people in the United Kingdom, for example, as well as in the United States, know the wugwan as the quan. Quan is the... So the quan literally, guan is a hall. It's short for the wugwan, which is the martial hall. That's the... So when they say the word hall, one has to think, they're actually referring to something that's kind of like a YMCA. It's a community center. So historically, unlike the dojo in Japan, the dojo is built sort of like a temple. So it's culturally isolated sort of unit where people go to do this sacred thing. The wugwan, in terms of how things are handled within it, can be a tad less formal because it can be a community center where people don't just practice martial arts. They also have social gatherings. They also have something for the kids. It's not a YMCA in the commercial sense, but it's a YMCA in the communal sense.
Right.
Originally, traditionally.
Yeah.
Then you have, of course, the cult.
Yeah.
Right.
We have some of those in historical martial arts too. And honestly, one of the things I had to work pretty hard at in the beginning was not allowing my new young school to develop into a cult. There were definitely people who came in the early days who wanted it to become a cult.
Other people seeking for spiritual meaning, right? We have a lack of spiritual meaning in our time.
But also looking for somebody to tell them what to do, right? A spiritual leader who would basically make all their decisions for them, and they wouldn't have to like think about the big scary stuff outside the training hall ever again.
Yeah, so
it's a difficult thing, because on the one hand you have students who want you to provide a service for them that on the face of it is kind of fine, but it leads in a direction where you end up becoming the unquestionable authority, and that is death to academic research. Right? Like, the worst thing that can happen to a scientist is when people just take his word for stuff and don't actually read their papers and, figure out whether they're actually right or not.
Oh, that's
right?
a problem we have in all of martial arts. There
absolutely.
are certain people who are into actually understanding, building a comprehensive understanding of the tradition, and other ones that join along for other reasons.
Yeah.
So we have the sports club, which can be a gym or a stable. We have the dojo or dojang. We have the wuguan. We have the cult. That, I mean, everybody knows how cults are, but they're specific to martial arts cults. We can discuss later. We have the temple, and the temple is it's its own type, but it's almost a subtype. Can be a subtype of any of the other ones. It's a school that handles itself as an isolated cultural sphere from the rest of society. So it can be an actual physical temple, or at times it's in Japanese martial arts, for example, that would be a honbo dojo, where it's the headquarters of the organization. But people ascend to the headquarters. They also almost, one could say, immigrate there for a period of a few weeks, a few months, a few years, in order to practice in isolation. And temple has its own dynamics, because then you have a temple bureaucracy. In temples, there is, generally speaking, almost always a guiding ideology, if not a religion. And you have to either have faith in that religion or at least pay lip service to it. It's not always called a religion. Sometimes it is. For example, you might be familiar with the one of the newer Japanese styles that was founded a few decades ago, called Shorinji Kenpo.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah, so Shorinji Kenpo, literally, by the way, in Chinese that would be Shaolin Chuanfa. Shorinji is Shaolin, and Kenpo is fist method, in Chinese Chuanfa. So they literally call the style Shaolin fist method, although it is, quite curiously, partly a recreated style. Okay. Or it's a manual inspired. It's part from manuals and paintings, part the founder's own ideas. The founder was Do Shinso. In any case, this is a religious organization.
Okay.
So going to practice at their Honbo Dojo is, in a way, you join in their religion, but it's not exactly like in Western religions, because the East Asian peoples have a different conception of what a religion is. For most East Asian people, unless they're either Christians or Muslims, even some of the Muslims, I suppose, a religion is something you add on. It's like I wouldn't want to put down a religion, but it's almost like a clothing item. It's something you choose to wear. It's what you show. It's what you express. So you can wear several clothing items on top of each other. Which one did you wear first, and which one was on top of it? You can change that. And religions have different functions, much like with attire. Some are for summer, some are for winter. So some religions they use for their weddings, others for their funerals, others yet for their everyday lives. So they're more flexible in their conception of, what it means to be religious and what a religion can be used for. It's not a monotheistic commitment. Even a lot of them who believe in a monotheistic religion would take on another religion, or maybe two of them, to be practiced or believed in a different area of their lives. And it's considered perfectly legitimate in Japan, in China, and in Korea. And therefore, People
So,
go.
so hang on. So we're talking about a religion which is not a requirement to believe a specific theology.
It could be. It could be. And it's very popular in certain areas of East Asia that, for example, you would just have to say, yes, I do believe that the founder was divinely inspired.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
Classic.
Yes, but not in the sense. But there is no agenda like, oh, he was divinely inspired. Now we have to conquer this or that country.
Or he was divinely inspired. Now we have to do everything he says forever.
Well, he's dead, so you
Right,
you
that
don't give
helps.
him money. You give money to his
Organization.
his organization. Yeah, but this was all just to say that people go and they might. For a much simpler example, people go to the Shaolin Temple.
Right.
The Shaolin Temple on Song Mountain. By the way, the Shaolin was a franchise of temples.
Yeah.
Both northern and southern China. So there, at one point in time, there are dozens of them, and they all belong in the Shaolin sect. Shaolin is the name of a Buddhist sect. That's the name itself means the young forest or the lesser forest or grove. But it simply refers to, most of these temples were in the areas of forests and groves. But the idea is you go to a Shaolin temple today, and there's certain Buddhist rituals, and you might bow to the statue of the Buddha, or you might say a Buddhist prayer in the morning. But do they care whether you might be a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian? They don't really mind as long as you do whatever they do at the temple. So in their view, there's no contradiction. And a lot of people go there and they feel like, okay, so whilst I'm in the temple, I behave like a Buddhist, and then at home, I'm a Confucian.
Right.
For them, that's legitimate. There's a different conception of religion in the East. So in any case, so we mentioned there is the sports club, there is the dojo or dojang, there's the wu guan, known as quan in Cantonese. There is the cult, there is the temple, and then the final one, the sixth one, is the recreational, which is likely the most common type of martial arts school. In a recreational, there is an instructor and there are trainees. Now, I know that in the martial arts, some people call themselves a Sifu or Shifu, some people call themselves a coach, some people call themselves an instructor. But I would say in the case of the recreational, it really is an instructor. The sole purpose of that person being there is to instruct, to just technically show how things work. They're not a teacher per se, most of them. They're not a father figure, they're not a leader. They're just there to instruct people on how to benefit themselves in some way, to have fun. And there's no deeper purpose to it. There's, of course, also famously, the subtype of the recreational we all know as the McDojo.
Yeah.
Yes, and the McDojo
Although the McDojo is very often presents itself as a cult or a gym or even a stable.
Yes, exactly. So the McDojo, in a sense, if we were to be honest about it, is usually a recreational because it only rises up to the level of being a recreational school. But there are certainly different types of McDojos that can, in a way, have a legit aspects of their curriculum and then a McDojo-ish type of attitude with other aspects. I can provide an example. I knew... No, that's a different combination. So of all of these six I mentioned, there could be combinations thereof. So the example I want to give now was of a dojo cult. The dojo cult is a very common one.
Very common.
Yes. So there was a certain school I knew, which was actually a fine school with an excellent curriculum. But then there are a lot of cultish elements in terms of, people would tell stories. Oh, the teacher killed a cow with a punch. And then there'd be a lot of stories like that. This is silly things that people would make up in order to glorify the teacher, who, by the way, mostly did not encourage this, but he also did not go against it. And there was one point in time when suddenly all the male students at the school went and did a mohawk. So that's always a suspicious sign.
That is straight out of Cobra Kai.
Exactly. I don't want to tarnish those good people's names and reputations. Some of them are really good people, but certainly there are a lot of Cobra Kai-esque elements to that chain of dojos actually for a certain period of time. But then again, the contents, the curriculum was actually quite good. So there could be a balance between, and it was a very traditional dojo, also affiliated with a very respectable organization in Okinawa. Mm-hmm. So, things are not black and white. There are many, many shades of gray in the martial arts. And likewise with the McDojo, you can have a McDojo that's quite malevolent, where the teacher is all about money, and the whole purpose of the McDojo is to enrich the owners.
Yep.
And there could be almost a naive McDojo where it's very low level, but the teacher is just this petty person who doesn't know better.
Okay, so how does all this relate to, so you've got this classification of different kinds of martial arts schools. How does this relate to the politics?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. Every type of school structure creates a different political dynamics. Let's take the example of the dojo. Dojo is built in a very bureaucratic, hierarchical fashion. The whole model of how dojos are operated today arose during the Meiji Restoration period in Japan, when the Japanese were basically saying, we lost a cultural war with the West. We were backwards with our social structure, backwards with our technology. We have to somehow create a new nation, which is Japanese in essence at its core, but also abandons a lot of our traditions in favor of Western ideas which have proven themselves to be more efficient. And we know them to be more efficient because they're supposedly won over us. The West did not conquer Japan during the 19th century, but the Japanese knew that had the West wanted to, with their ships and with their armies, they could.
Right. And the Japanese were very deliberate about what they incorporated into their culture and what they left out.
Exactly.
There's a whole bunch of really interesting books on that exact topic. It wasn't, the stuff sort of filtered in. It was like, no, we will take this, we will not take that.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yes. And one of the things they took wholeheartedly was fascism, which for them...
yeah, unfortunately.
Yes. For them, it was just an almost a direct continuation of their older feudal system. It was just a more efficient way to do their traditional feudalism.
Right.
And in fascism, you need hierarchy, and you need commitment to cause, and you need structure. And if you go into a traditional Japanese dojo, and that is not meant, this is just descriptive, I don't mean to put them down, because there are also many advantages to the things I would be describing now. Social advantages, practical advantages. You see how things are very orderly. Even before you step in the place, you bow to the dojo itself, because the place has cultural significance. It has spiritual meaning. Now that in particular comes from Shinto, from the Japanese folk religion, which has it that every object, everything, certainly living things in the universe, has a soul, has a spiritual dimension to it. So I can bow to an object like the building that is the dojo because I respect it. So you show respect even before you step in. Then you step in and you bow to one another, you bow to the teacher, you bow to your friends. Then the class is due to begin its on time, always has to be exactly on time, which is a very Japanese and a very non-Chinese thing, by the way.
But it's a very me thing. Like all my classes, they start on time. Once in 22 and a half years of doing this full time for a living, one seminar of mine started 3 minutes late because I got stuck behind a series of tractors and a 2-hour drive took me 3 hours. right? And my class started 3 minutes late. And to this day, it haunts me.
Let me tell you something. I would just diverge here for 1 second just to say I used to be like that. And then I had this whole problem with, how do you deal with adults who are late? I'm an adult, you're an adult.
Push-ups.
But yes, but then I agree. I would put them in a horse stance, and say, oh, that's good training, So what we would do in the years prior is you're 5 minutes late. That's 5 minutes in horse step.
Okay.
By the way, in Chinese, horse step and horse stance, because the steps are supposed to be dynamic. But that's another thing. So you 10 minutes late, you got to stand for 10 minutes, which is really, really difficult.
That's really hard.
So by the time they were supposed to be 15 minutes late, they'd rather just not come rather than stand for 15 minutes.
My solution is the class starts on time. If the warm-up is still going on, you can just do 10 push-ups and join the warm-up, right? If the warm-up is over, you've missed the class, but you're welcome to stay and watch for as long as you want. And it was never any kind of, you've been naughty. It was just, we want everyone to go through the warm-up so that they are safe to do the joint locks and things we're going to be doing, right? So to my mind, it was more of it's better for the teacher that they know who's going to be in their class, so they don't have to deal with late entries. And it's better for the students present if everyone has warmed up and gotten to know each other and done the whole kind of easing into the whole class mentality thing. So
I mean, it works.
Yeah.
These are good solutions. They work. But what happened was, over time, I just shifted and I began to do things the Chinese way. That's how Chinese teachers do. Is simply the teacher declares he's at this and that hour at the park, and people just come. But the way it works, it only works because the way I teach a class is, at times they all practice together, and much of the time they practice by themselves or with me. So I go between people. I constantly shift. So I'll spend half a minute with this person, then I go to the next person. Then someone might ask a good question, then I bring them all together to work on that thing I wanted to explain to them. So it's a little more laid back to begin with. And therefore, what I do nowadays, they know that I'll be at the park for 2 to 2.5 hours on a given day. And they can come whenever they like, and they can leave whenever they like. But it's recommended that they come for at least an hour and a half. Many come for 2 hours. And the first person that comes, we do several people come together. We do bowing, seated bowing like they do in traditional Japanese martial arts. Mm-hmm. And the last people that remain, we also do bowing. But for people who come in the middle of it, we do standing salutations, which is the Chinese way to start and close a class. So I combine both. By the way, the reason that I started the bowing thing, which is, it used to be Chinese, the tradition came from China, Chinese just let it go over the years, is that Israelis are very unruly, and I felt that I needed to literally bow them down. And Yes, and have them wear traditional attire and shows a little bit more respect. Otherwise, the classes were chaotic. I started very casual. When I started teaching, there were no uniforms, there's no bowing, there's no calling me Shifu. Within a few months, I saw that if I was not going to introduce those concepts, things are going to remain chaotic and this is going to go nowhere.
Right. And this is an interesting point, right? Every culture, I have groups that I train with all over the world, right? And every single one of them has a different culture, and it reflects the needs of the local situation. And in some areas, what they need is a clear hierarchy and a clear rank structure so that students can progress through the equivalent of like belt ranks. We don't use belts, but you get the idea. Mm-hmm. Other places, I just sort of turn up and there's a bunch of people there and we just decide what we're going to do, and then we just sort of do it and they all have a nice time. And it's basically a totally flat hierarchy, and there's no kind of rank development of any kind, right? Mm. I don't actually care, right? What I care is that the students who come get what they came for and leave healthier and better martial artists than they were when they arrived, right? That's it. And whatever local structure is necessary to help that to happen, that's what we use. So again, some places use uniforms, some places don't. And it is very much kind of culturally dependent. And it's interesting to hear that, if I go and teach in Israel, I need to make sure that they are wearing uniforms and they call me Dr. Windsor or Sir or something. And, just give them a bit of external structure, because otherwise it will be chaos. That's a useful tip.
Yeah, just following with what you're just saying, I was told that in Germany, they expect a strong leader. We also see it historically. And they desire that the person who's going to teach them has to have the right qualifications and also the right attitude to be able, he doesn't have to be cocky, but he has to be able to prove to them that he does know better. And this is a German cultural expectation, because in their minds, it goes like, if he's not better than I, then why am I even here? He has to be an expert.
Right. Yeah, and you say that, and I teach quite often in Germany, and although depending on where I am, the whole hierarchy thing doesn't necessarily even apply. They do like the fact that I've got a PhD. That's like, yes, it's Dr. Windsor. That's good. And Lufthansa is one of the very few airlines in the world where when you book your ticket, right, you have a whole load of different potential titles. Like Ryanair, you're Mr., Mrs., Ms. or Miss. That's it. But on Lufthansa, it's, are you doctor? Are you professor doctor? If you've got 2 doctorates, you could be professor doctor. It's like they've got you covered. But again, that's just a cultural thing. And, I don't care either way. My students all call me Guy these days. And it's just, but going to a new area, it's helpful to know what those students need, culturally speaking, to get them into the mindset where they will get the best out of the seminar.
Yeah, Israelis typically believe that they know better than everybody. And they don't expect the hierarchy, but they respect the hierarchy if it's imposed upon them. So it's unlike the Japanese desire the hierarchy. In Japanese culture, there needs to be a certain measure of hierarchy for them to feel comfortable with the organization to begin with.
Right.
Israelis are not in actual psychological need of hierarchy, but without hierarchy, they quickly begin to think that why couldn't I just do this technique that way? I'll just try it.
Yeah.
I'll just try it. Yeah. And
as Frank said, it's one of the few modern nations that still has conscription. Now, for good kind of historical reasons, but it's that sort of that imposition of society is in a position to literally require a year or whatever it is of your life. Yeah.
Oh, it's actually 3 years for men.
3 years?
3 years for men and 2 years for women. I served for 3 years.
Really? What service did you do?
So I began as an infantryman with the Golani Brigade 13th Battalion. And following my infantry boot camp, I was injured. So my medical profile was lowered. You get a medical score. And if the score is too low due to an injury or an illness or whatnot, then you cannot be in infantry. So they transferred me to the Israeli police force, which is unusual. There aren't a lot of people who go through their mandatory service with the Israeli police force. The majority of them just work for 911. But I was through some let's just say internal politicking, talking the right way to the right people. I got myself into investigations. So I was with Major Crimes Unit, Tel Aviv Central Unit in Jaffa. Rapists, arsonists, murderers, crime families, stuff like that. Yeah, so
that's a fascinating way to do some national service.
Oh, certainly it was. So that was for over 2.5 years of my life I spent there. It's a 24-hour job. You're supposed to, on paper, it's a 9-hour workday. On average, it's a 12-hour workday.
Yeah.
And if you happen to arrest a whole crime family, that's a 4-day without any sleep workday.
Wow. Yeah. It's like a friend of mine got a job when he said, well, this is a half-time job, right? And they said, what do you mean? He said, well, it's 12 hours per day, but I get to choose which 12. And they were like, yeah, okay, you get it. In you come.
Exactly. Yeah, police everywhere are understaffed. There's no. I don't think there's a country where there are too many policemen. It doesn't tend to happen.
Well, I mean, I don't know. There are certainly areas where the police are given too much money to buy tanks.
Oh yeah, so that certainly happens. There could be there are always certain departments within a police force in every nation that get too much money and get too many men. But for the most part, most police units are understaffed.
Well, that's true.
Anyway, we have to go back to we're just talking about hierarchy at the dojo, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's right.
Yes. So the class begins and they all sit in a row, and traditionally the lower ranking belts are on one side and the higher ranking belts are on the other side. You're positioned, based on your belt rank, and then the most senior black belt or two of them, or the sensei's assistant, are sitting next to them. And the assistant might sit diagonally while the sensei sits right in front of the others. And then they all bow to the sensei, and then they all bow to the assistant, and then they bow back to them, and then they turn sideways and bow to each other. Before all of that, they bow to the shomen, which is the main wall where they have a little temple. Which,
it's like an icon or a little altar.
Originally, the idea is it's a Shinto religious icon. Now, the intention is not religious in most Western dojos, but it stands to the little temple on the kamidana. Kamidana is literally in Japanese the spirit shelf. It's the little shelf that they put the little wooden temple on top of, and the wooden temple represents it's the physical manifestation of the spirit of the place. Because, like I said, in Shinto, everything and every place has its spirit. So you bow to the spirit of the place, and then if there are often pictures of founders or previous teachers on the wall, so you bow to them, and then the sensei, the assistant, then the students to one another, and then you can begin a class, and then during the class, before each partner practice, you bow to one another, etc. If the teacher says "yame, yame," you should stop. Everybody stops, like they're robots, right? It's immediately. It's of course that's very important in all of martial arts that teacher says stop.
We have the same thing in all of my classes, because it could be everyone needs to stop because we're about to do something else, but it could also be everyone needs to stop because the practice is getting dangerous and someone's about to have an accident, and so we have to stop right now.
Exactly, yeah. But you can see, when you experience this at the Japanese dojo, you see the level of obedience and the seriousness of how people perceive it to be. That's different. Yeah. And they're all, of course, dressed in pure white, and white is a pure color. But only, and then there's the black belt hierarchy, right? And I know dojos that they have restrooms and toilets which are black belts only.
Oh, Jesus.
Yeah, that's a thing. It's a thing.
I bet. Okay, all right. So you're getting into lots of detail about how some Japanese dojos are run, but we've sort of skipped over the whole politics thing.
Oh, so it leads to it. So what happens is, if I have my own showers and toilets that are different to yours, then am I better than you? If I'm a black belt and all the senior black belts have their pictures on the wall, and your picture's not on the wall. So, of course, first of all, you can look at it in two different ways, or both together. You can be jealous, or you can say, oh, I aspire to that. I also want my picture on the wall. Or I can be jealous and want my picture on the wall. And maybe he got the better position for his picture. Why shouldn't my picture, be higher than his picture? I feel I just landed a kick on this guy. He's been training for 10 years. I've only been training for a year. I think I bettered him in sparring yesterday. So shouldn't my picture be on the wall? Dynamics. And then I go and I tell my friend, I should be promoted already. Why? And the friend says, why haven't you been promoted? He says, why won't you go to the sensei? And you go to sensei and you say, Sensei, I'm very serious. I want to teach this martial art in the future. And say you've been around longer for you. You've been around, say you're a brown belt, you've been around for, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And the sensei has to, he has his gears turning in his head. He thinks, those other 3 black belts I have actually suck. I don't like them that much.
But
This guy's
how?
a brown belt. And
Okay, that sensei's a dick.
Of course, I'm just giving you, actual examples of how the politics transpire, right? And the sensei thinks, but this guy actually wants to train. This guy is a better fighter than them. Maybe I should promote him, and then in 6 months I should get him like the next black belt, and I should sort of accelerate his progress because there is an interest here. Maybe the sensei likes him better as a person. Maybe he's a better martial artist, and then the sensei wants to promote him quicker so he can open another dojo for him, which could mean more respect or more money or both. Maybe, just maybe, that also happens. The student happens to be female and something's going on between her and the sensei. So these are just random examples of things that actually do on occasion happen in traditional martial arts. And that's how people think, and then there could be another example, could be a bunch of teachers, not just senseis. It doesn't have to be from Japanese martial arts. And the buddies, they meet every Friday and they have a sit down, they talk martial arts and life. And one guy says, your dojo looks kind of empty. Why won't I, you've been teaching 30 years. I really want to give you something. You're my friend. I'll give you an award. So he awards him for, I don't know, this and this teacher of the year, or lifetime achievement award, blah, blah, blah. And then the guy hangs it on the wall of his school. Then the fellow who got the lifetime honorary blah 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 goes a few months later and he does a special ceremony in his school and he gives this other friend an honorary black belt, which yes, there is such a thing, like an honorary academic degree, honorary black belt in his style that the other guy never actually trained in. And then the guy who got the honorary black belt can say, I'm also a black belt in that style. Like people say I'm a doctor and it's an honorary doctor, right?
Yeah. Only a dick.
Well, you say that, but it's quite common. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, okay, but only a dick. Like if you have an honorary doctorate, I know people who have honorary doctorates and they don't call themselves Dr. So-and-so and they maybe have an honorary doctorate in, I don't know, in law, for example. And they don't claim to be a lawyer based on an honorary doctorate in law.
Oh, well, you wouldn't want to do that here in Israel. That would not turn out well.
Exactly. So what you're describing at the moment is basically people who are arseholes behaving badly. But I'm more interested in the politics that comes about when people who are acting in good faith nonetheless end up creating schisms and camps and end up at loggerheads with each other without this sort of what's the word, scheming or conniving or underhand stuff. It's like I mean, you see in historical martial arts world all the time, right? There are people who are, for example, studying the works of Fiore de Liberi, as I do, right? And they are divided into camps based on like how they interpret a specific bit of the book, or how they, how well they adapt Fiore's art to the modern tournament scene or whatever. And you end up with people who on the face of it, they should be all getting along because they all love the same sources and they all train and they're all serious about it and they're all nice to their students. And we're not talking about dicks here. But still, nonetheless, because of the natural human tendency for people to identify with a tribe, and what is outside my tribe is therefore by definition other and therefore shouldn't be trusted, you get this sort of separation into specific camps. So like 20 years ago, if you showed up to a historical fencing event, it didn't really matter what you studied. It didn't really matter what level you were at, because there were so few of us that the notion of, oh my God, you're mad about swords and think the historical sources are cool. Brilliant. You're definitely one of us. Welcome to the tribe. But as the tribe grew bigger and bigger and bigger, and yes, there were some bad actors, but leaving those aside, even the good actors naturally sort of separated themselves out into camps. And sometimes in those camps, a myth of superiority over other camps develops, not because of any one person saying bad things about other people, but it's just, if you have that kind of looking inwards towards your tribe viewpoint, you will tend to see it through rose-tinted spectacles, and when you look outside, you're looking perhaps more rationally. And so you get this sort of, this siloing of what was a small, relatively harmonious community. That's debatable. But it silos, and it becomes unnecessarily fragmented simply because people identify with tribes.
Yes, I think that tradition naturally gives rise to politics, because once you have to define what the thing is, then you have to define the borders, and
Right.
anybody who then steps outside of those borders is what? Is a traitor, is an outsider, he's a bad person, you know. But I have a very good example to provide for you in that regard. So what often happens, especially in the Chinese martial arts, in the Japanese martial arts, they tend to write down much, if not all, of their curriculum. So, you know, I'm a brown belt, and this is the amount. This is the list of things that I'm going to be studying as a brown belt, give or take. And as a third degree black belt, this is what is expected of me. In the Chinese martial arts, not so. I do make an effort to write much of my curriculum down, but there's so much wisdom which is contained between the lines in the heart-to-heart transmission between a teacher and a student. And what the Chinese teachers have done all throughout history is that they don't give an equal measure of knowledge to all of their students. Now, this has to do with Confucian culture. So Confucius taught, we know this from the Confucian Analects, which is a book written by his students because he did not write anything. In the Analects, there is one verse that says something along the lines of, and I hope I'm quoting very accurately here, if I give the student 1/4 and the student cannot inquire and come back to me with the other 3/4, then I would not bother teach that student again. So there is a cultural expectation by teachers in China, not just martial arts teachers, but all traditionally minded teachers in China for thousands of years now, that, you know, it doesn't have to be only I give him 1/4, it has to come back with the other 3/4, but I need to be able to provide a foundation and then give out hints, and the student needs to work hard to comprehend the greater bulk of it on their own. Otherwise, they're not learning. Otherwise, I'm spoon feeding them. So Chinese teachers, traditionally what they would do, if the student is lazy or is not scholarly gifted, at least in terms of studying the martial arts, not necessarily in terms of reading and such, because most of Chinese martial arts teachers throughout history have been illiterate. If they just don't like that student, or maybe they have good reasons to not trust that student. Maybe that student killed somebody in a brawl, and maybe he killed somebody in a brawl before they were their student, but since they killed a person, maybe they cannot be trusted. Maybe that student is involved in some shady business. Maybe that student belongs with a gang, etc. So often in a traditional Japanese dojo, and there would be exceptions, if a student belongs in a gang, they would tell him, quit the gang or you're out. Or they wouldn't even have him as a student at the dojo. Again, there are exceptions, but generally speaking. A Chinese teacher would say, yeah, so what? So he's in a gang. That's his own life. Yeah, he can be in a gang. None of my business. I'll teach him to the extent that I feel comfortable with, given I know he is a gang member, which might be a lot or might not be much, but he's a paying student, isn't he? What's wrong here? If he does something bad, that's on him. That's not on me. That's a very Chinese way to think about relationships in general. They don't assume personal responsibility much for the actions of another person. In the West, we have this Judeo-Christian conception of, you know, if my son went and he killed somebody, then I'm guilty. I'm a bad father. Now, what kind of education they give that person? He's my own son. In Chinese culture, yeah, they might feel bad, but there's no, it's not that they're not moral. They're on average just as moral as any other human on the planet. It's just that culturally They say, everybody has their own karma. Everybody has their own life. Maybe I did my best. He's a problem person. All right. It's just a part of life. So how does that lead to politics? So what happens is this. With a Chinese teacher, let's say the Chinese teacher had 10 students. And those 10 students each spent 20 years, no less, with that teacher. So 10 students each for 20 years. By the end of those 20 years, with a traditionally minded Chinese martial arts teacher, each of them is going to come out with a very different take on the exact same system.
Sure.
To the degree. Now, and of course, that happens in all of martial arts, but in Chinese martial arts, that can be to the degree that some of them are really high-level practitioners who know the whole system, and some of them are still around the same level they were at after a year or two of training.
Yeah, so they didn't have 20 years of training. They had 1 year of training 20 times.
Exactly.
Yeah, we see that a lot.
Now, the interesting thing is that can happen organically as a result of bad practice. But in Chinese martial arts, that often happens with the teacher intending this to happen. The teachers intend to keep some people at the level of 1 or 2 years and keep them there because they didn't like the person or the person couldn't be trusted or whatever.
That's outrageous. Like, what the hell? Like, if I had a student like that, it was like, okay, I'm happy to give you your first year of training, but I think you're a dick, so I do not want to give you any more than that. I would have to say, look, I just don't want to teach you anymore.
Oh, so you see, this has to do with your background in jurisprudence.
I don't have a background in jurisprudence.
Oh, you have a cultural background in jurisprudence.
Okay.
What you're so I have a legal education. I have a law degree and I have a government studies degree.
Okay,
and
I don't have either of those things.
Yeah, what you're just talking about is actually a cultural perception of contractual law. So if you think about it, you're just talking about the type of contract that is between a teacher and a student. What kind of unwritten contract do we have?
Yeah.
Can we say that within that contract, as a teacher, you are obligated to ensure to the best of your ability that the student keeps progressing as the years go by? And you say, you believe wholeheartedly, as most people would believe, by the way, in the West, that it is most certainly your responsibility to push that student forward as much as possible under the circumstances.
I wouldn't phrase it, hang on, no. I would say I have to give them my best efforts and an environment in which, if they choose to take the opportunities in front of them, they will progress as well as they reasonably could.
Yes.
Right?
Which in the West, we believe...
I'm not so much into the pushing the students, I'm more into creating a space in front of them for them to step into if they want to. But that's...
Of course, that is...
But contractually speaking, yes. Give them... They're entitled to my best efforts, and if I'm not willing to give those best efforts, I am morally obliged to make it clear to the student that I'm not going to give them my best efforts and they should go somewhere else.
That is, give or take, exactly what I believe also, as a person, as a teacher.
Sure.
We must understand, though, that this is a cultural...
It's cultural. Of course it is.
Yes, it's a cultural perception. For the Chinese teacher, there's nothing morally wrong in them saying, for whatever reason, he didn't earn it, that's his problem. So they would say, for example, I'll give you the counter argument. The Chinese teacher would say, well, this person didn't try to transform himself. He didn't become a better person individually. So why am I obligated? Like, he didn't make that. You remember the 3 quarters? He didn't come to me with the other 3 quarters. So yeah, and the Chinese teacher would say in their minds, right? Because there's actually no debate on these topics in Chinese culture that I've ever seen. So curiously, the Chinese amongst themselves don't even talk about it. It's a non-issue for them. But in their minds, they would say, so he's been around 5 years, 10 years. Can't he see that he's still the same level he was after a year or two?
Why hasn't he quit?
Yeah.
So it's on the student to quit.
Yeah, they'd say, that's on him. He should go to another teacher. That's not my problem. That's on him.
Okay. Yeah. I can see that.
But then it gets worse. It gets worse because, say that teacher died prematurely. Maybe that teacher was 50, 60 years old and he suddenly passed away, has a heart attack or whatever. And then the school remains with a bunch of students who've actually studied most or the whole system, and a bunch of people who had gotten that ill treatment of, staying that same year for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones that got the more complete transmission, some of them go and open, say, 2 or 3 schools. And the other ones who were stepping in place for 20 years, they see they see their friends and they say, I can open a school as well. So now they're going to open a school, and the curriculum is going to be very low level, and they won't even comprehend the curriculum. Otherwise, if they understood their low level, typically they wouldn't even try to open a school unless they're business minded and want to make money. And then they teach students, and then those students might not only get the low quality curriculum, but those people who stepped in place for 20 years might choose certain students to treat the same, and then these students would be even worse.
Yeah, so you get martial arts basically watered down to nothing.
Yes. This is one of the many ways that martial arts can go extinct. They become diluted due to interpersonal politics over generations, and it's not a new thing. I think it's been happening, at least in China, for centuries.
It's been happening in every area of life where skill is transmitted since forever. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a natural human thing. But
that particular dynamic wherein the teacher feels that he doesn't have the commitment to teach a quote-unquote a nobody his thing. And you'd say, it's not nobody. That guy spent 20 years with you. He also paid every month for 20 years. So what's up? Mm-hmm. And he says, no, that's a nobody. Why? And that takes us another direction, which is how the Chinese perceive the relationships in martial arts lineages. And that is unlike the Japanese, where in Japanese traditions, it's typically very hierarchical and more meritocratic. In Chinese martial arts, it's family-based. So the martial arts school is a family. But you don't get to be a part of the family by merely paying monthly tuition. So when people...
Yeah, I have a friend who was legally adopted by his grandmaster before he opened his school.
Yes. So this is common. So what we do is, when you step into the school for the first time, you are, quote-unquote, a paying customer. That's how a lot of Chinese people would view it. You're a paying customer, or you come in, you get a service, you get what you paid for and what you're worth. Not just what I'm worth, but also what you're worth. Mm-hmm. If you've proven yourself over years and proven to prove oneself would get to that in the moment, what that could mean, you may be adopted into the martial arts family. Now, usually it doesn't mean there's no legal papers, but you undergo a ceremony called the Bai Shi, to bow down to the teacher. And you literally, the teacher would, traditionally the custom is the teacher sits on a chair, you kneel on the floor and you bow down to them like you would bow to a king in medieval times. Bow down with your head to the floor 3 times. Mm-hmm. You offer them a cup of tea. They drink the tea. You might offer them a gift. In my case, it's always has to be a very modest gift. I ask for something very modest, very small. It's only symbolic, but in China they often give a red envelope. Has to be red. Red is the color of success, of money, of prosperity, of joy. Red envelope with money. Yeah, some Chinese teachers are quite greedy. People can put in $10,000 in the red envelope, but that's not. I would say that's not even the majority. So it's usually symbolic. And there would be things said. In my case, what I do is there's a ceremony beforehand. So we before all that ceremonial stuff. We would have speeches. I would give a speech about the student. The student would give a speech about their experiences at the school. There would be witnesses. You would bring most of the other students to witness the event, even those who are not within the martial arts family. You'd bring your teachers if you can. And it's sort of like a wedding. You wed into, and many people call it that, you wed into the system and you take on a vow to continue. You say you carry on the system, but actually it's not about carrying on the system as much as it is carrying on your relationship in a familial way with your teacher for the rest of your life. So the obligations taken are that the teacher ought to take care of you as if you were his son, and you take care of the teacher as if he was your father. It doesn't mean you're a father and a son. The relationship is not the same. And oftentimes the student might be older than you, so obviously he cannot be your son. But you take care of one another like family. And once a student has been introduced into the martial arts family, then there are no secrets, there are no borders, and it's the complete opposite of being a paying customer. Now, the teacher would treat you as if he was teaching his son. So now the metric for success is your success is my success. And there are great efforts being undertaken so you can get the farthest within the scope of the tradition as possible. Now, as to what makes a disciple, this is something I've written about before in my book, The Martial Arts Teacher. Is also going to appear in my soon-to-be published book. I hope to finish it within 2 or 3 months, Martial Arts Politics Explained. I introduce my standards, and each teacher has his own different standards as to, how should a person prove themselves to be worthy of becoming a member of the martial arts family. So they have to have a good heart, they have to have a good name, they have to be practicing hard, not necessarily for a specific number of years, because people vary, right? Some people can prove themselves, technically speaking, within 5 years, after 10 years. And there are several other parameters and such. In my case, the students undergo 2 different types of tests. One is a technical test. They have to go past a certain level of the curriculum just as to pass that limit in order to see that they're really serious. That's like an equivalent of a black belt test. We don't have we don't have ranks in the same way though. And the other one is a personal test. So that is designated for each student based on something which is very difficult for them to do. So my 2 disciples that I've taken until today, one had problem with personal drive and perseverance. So his test was, you have to practice. Now, I wouldn't be there throughout the time, but you have to practice every day for 6 hours a day for a month, because he was young. He was 18 years old. He had the strength and stamina for it, but he needed the drive. So I gave him the drive.
He also had the time.
He also had the time, yes. And then that person eventually became a top film editor in Hollywood with that kind of drive. So and he stopped practicing martial arts, but I figure some of it worked.
Sure.
Because he wouldn't have had that type of drive before. Something transitioned there, something transformed. So that's very good. I consider it. He doesn't practice martial arts, but I consider him a great success. Of course, it's mostly his.
I have students like that where they stop doing the stuff that I teach, but they use the stuff that I've taught them to do very well elsewhere. Yeah, that's very satisfying.
Yeah, so I'm saying, yes, sometimes some of our best students are not our best students in the martial arts, right?
Right.
And the other fellow, he was smoking for 20 years. And it was very difficult. He told me a number of times it was very difficult for him to quit. So I told him there would be no smokers in my martial arts family. And that was it. He had to quit smoking. For him, that was a very difficult ordeal. And he did.
Good for him.
Now, unfortunately, he then kept smoking pot, because I was talking about cigarettes. I didn't know about the pot. I should have put that in. But,
so he finessed it a little bit. Okay. But still, he quit the cigarettes, which is a good thing.
Yeah, that's pretty good. Okay, so I think for every student, that should be a different personal test. And I mean, even if they are no longer with you, at least they have made a personal transformation, which is very important.
Right.
And it is considered acceptable because of that familial structure. Okay, you want to be a part of this martial arts family, then prove yourself in some way. And sometimes, just practicing, you can force yourself through a physical practice to get to a certain level. Because it's not a very high level to get into a martial arts family, but the personal test is the real hard one. And traditionally, what the Chinese do, a lot of Chinese teachers say there is an idiom: 10 years to get through the door. 10 years to get through the door. They would like to observe a person for 10 years at least before they're willing to accept them as disciples. disciple, 2D in Chinese, that is the traditional term. And the longer I teach, the more I see that indeed that is not a radical way of thinking about it. It can take, because you don't live with those people. They're not your romantic partners. If a romantic partner, maybe you know them very well after a year and a half or 2 years. But if you don't live with the person, it could take the upwards of 10 years sometimes to really know them well. And also to see that essentially for a decade, they haven't screwed up in a big way.
Or in an unrecoverable way, yeah. Okay, so remember, you contacted me to ask about how things are done in historical martial arts, and you spent a lot of time telling us about how things are done in the Asian martial arts. What did you actually want to know from me?
Okay, so specifically, we just described the 6 main types of schools that are common in martial arts today, that are most common, which were the sports club, the dojo, the wugwan, the cult, the temple, and the recreational. And because historical European martial arts are an in development tradition, which is just now falling into different sub-styles and divisions, I would first like to ask, how do you see those schools in light of those 6 categories which I was just describing?
Okay. I would say that the club, so stables and gym distinction, there are quite a few stables who are aimed at basically producing tournament winners. There are a lot of gyms who are basically aimed at giving people a fun way to get fit and stay fit and pursue personal goals. And yes, tournaments, they may go to tournaments, they may not, but the club isn't, the club does not define its success by the number of tournament winners that it has. We certainly see a lot of recreational clubs. I would say that most of the Society for Creative Anachronism clubs that I have come across, I would put in that camp. They're not particularly interested in winning tournaments. It's not really a gym either. They don't really train like that at all. It's mostly people show up and they get given a little bit of basic instruction and then they just fence their friends. And so it's recreational, but I don't mean that term to suggest that it's trivial in these people's lives. It's a very, very important part of their social life and their sense of community. So there's elements of, as you were describing the dojo, as like a community center. There's quite a lot of that going on. So we don't see temples in the historical martial arts tradition particularly.
Not yet, I should say.
Not yet, no.
That would count down.
Yeah.
In castles, by the way, if I were to predict, because I have a good friend, Grandmaster Keith Kernsberg. Are you familiar with him?
No.
So he is the most successful European martial arts teacher to have ever lived, perhaps in history, because prior to COVID, his organization, he teaches Wing Chun. His organization had 60,000 students all throughout Europe, which is bigger than most. Yeah, that's a lot of students. And Grandmaster Kernsberg, back in the days, I think between roughly the mid-1980s, if I'm not mistaken, then beginning of the 21st century, he rented a castle in Germany as his headquarters.
Good for him.
Yeah,
excellent. But that's not historical martial arts. That's Wing Chun. So
yes, but they did a little bit of recreated historical European martial arts there.
Okay, hang on,
by building
there are lots of people. There are lots of people who have swung long swords and rapiers and things around, and have done all sorts of like experimenting with it. I mean, most famously, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's grandson in the 1950s borrowed armor from his grandpa's house. Obviously, Conan Doyle was long dead by this point, but they were strapping on actual, genuine 15th century suits of armor and whacking their friends. That's not historical martial arts because it's not based on historical research.
Okay, so I know what you're saying, and I'm in agreement. There's a good friend of Kernsberg is Master Bill Newman, who actually started with Eskrima, and he, over the years, he transitioned into using European weapons I'm not sure how manual-based he is, but Bill Newman is also quite well-known. And he'd done a lot of European weapons fighting, not historical European martial arts.
Exactly. European weapons fighting is a better way to describe it. And the thing is, if you study Eskrima or any other kind of weapons-based art, you can pick up a sword of any kind and do something useful with it.
Exactly. And so the whole point was saying, in my view, it's only a matter of time before somebody takes the initiative and creates a quote-unquote temple-like school in a castle.
There will be eventually. So a lot of these clubs and schools, and there are various sort of formal structures for them, they take their format from a martial art that the teacher has previously studied, right? So, for example, in my school, the uniform for those groups that use uniforms is a white T-shirt, dark trousers, right, with a school logo on the chest. And I just stole that from a friend of mine who runs a kung fu, or used to run a kung fu school, where that was their uniform. And I was like, that is completely non-cultural. It's just like the sort of trousers that you find in pretty much every culture that does trousers and a T-shirt. And it is like, it's not, because the problem is, one of the things that we have to do as historical martial artists is we have to see how the clothing of the period affects the movement style of the period and some various other things. So one of the things we need to do is actually have period gear that's made properly and wear that and use that in the research process, right? But the problem with that is I teach like 6 or 7 different historical styles. I am not going to require that my students have 6 or 7 different suits of historical gear for each different style. And in a given night, I might teach 3 of those different styles to 3 different groups of students. And I'm not going to be changing my clothes between classes. It doesn't make sense. So,
in that way, you're similar to, in concept, to Masaki Hatsumi sensei from Japan. You know him?
Yeah.
Yeah, because he went and he studied with those elderly masters of ninjutsu and samurai arts, and he brought in 9 different styles under one umbrella and created his Bujinkan. Now, I know there are fans of Bujinkan and people who can't stand it. I'm not getting into that politics now. But I'm just saying, conceptually, this is very interesting because he also has his school looks like a bigger version of your office with all the books and different weapons hung from many different traditions. And then he has to bring all of these styles together under one roof, which is a big challenge.
But there's one thing that I don't do. I don't combine the styles, right? They are absolutely, it's like if I was teaching, let's say I was a language teacher and I could teach, French and Italian and Hebrew, right? I wouldn't teach my students a mixture of French, Italian, and Hebrew. My Hebrew students would learn Hebrew from me, not that I speak a word of it. My French students would learn French from me, and so on, right? It's like that. It's like they are absolutely distinct because if you start to blend them together, what you get is a kind of anti-historical mess.
Let me ask you about that just for a moment. I'm very curious because in Chinese martial arts, one of the things that eased people's attempts to combine different styles, I don't know about the Bujinkan scenario because I'm not familiar enough with those different traditions, but in Chinese martial arts, they all share the same movement concepts. So they all share the same type. So they have the same types of steps in combat, or very similar ones. They also share a very similar culture. And so for example, concepts of yin and yang. And what does it mean when your palm faces this way or that way? Is that yin or yang? Well, most Chinese styles would agree, even if they look very different. Because conceptually they're closer like that due to their shared culture, it's easier for them to speak with one another and to integrate if they so desire.
Yeah. Well, yes, the styles that I'm teaching come from wildly different cultures, right? And so, for example, the footwork and mechanics we use for early 17th century Italian rapier are totally inappropriate for early 15th century Italian knightly combat, right? the culture itself that they're coming from isn't that distinct, but the martial context in which these actions are going to be applied completely different. So yeah, I mean, blending early 15th century Italian longsword with early 17th century Italian rapier, it would just be a disaster. Although people do it in tournaments all the time. So there we go.
That makes sense, yes.
Yeah. So, but my point was basically, I come from a specific kind of specific to me. I mean, background. I've had this Tai Chi teacher, and I've been to that karate class, and I've studied this kung fu and that aikido, and blah blah blah. And so I've been influenced by these various teachers. Just to keep in with the tradition thing, my Tai Chi teacher's name was Steve Fox. His wife is Kedzi Fox. Kedzi Fox trained with Chen Manqing. So that's my Tai Chi lineage, because I know Chinese martial artists care about that sort of thing. So that has impacted how I run my classes, how I ran my school when I was running it as a specific training environment. And, you know, I've seen people who've come from a much more sport fencing background. I mean, I did have a lot of sport fencing in my background, but I took my martial arts school structures from, I guess, I was mostly influenced by Japanese and Chinese martial arts that I've practiced in the way I set up my school. That's quite interesting,
because you mentioned you studied the Chen Manqing lineage, and that is a very laid-back type of school.
Yeah, very laid back. I love it. Like, there's no ranks, no bowing, no anything. It was all just, you know, we showed up and Steve threw us through the walls, and then we figured out how to throw each other through the walls, and it was great fun.
Yeah, because we should tell listeners that Chen Manqing was an artist, a painter, and a big drinker, and
total alcoholic. Yeah.
And so he was a very laid-back type of person.
Yeah. And his lineage begins with him, and he began it in the 1940s, so it's a very recent Tai Chi lineage too. But anyway, but if we say go to some of my colleagues in America, their club or school that they have founded will be coming from a different set of sort of backgrounds, and maybe they come from sport fencing, so the structure of the classes is closer to a sport fencing class, and the way the whole thing is run is closer to how sport fencing is taught and trained. Other people are coming from a reenactment or living history or SCA background, and so again they're structuring their club completely differently. So some clubs have formal rank structures, some clubs have no hierarchy at all, some clubs are very sort of strict and formal in the way things are taught. Some clubs have a lot more play. You know, it's because we don't have a common model to draw from that the models are so widely different. Mm-hmm. There's no such thing as like a standard historical martial arts school or club in the world. It doesn't exist.
Yes, of course. That makes sense. I mean, the standardization that came about in Chinese martial arts, first of all, it took probably thousands of years. And secondly, it was greatly strengthened by two cultural elements. One was the military, because the Chinese martial arts arise from three sources primarily. One is the military, the other is civilian life, and the third is temples. And those three sources, the military, the civilian life, and temples, also share knowledge with one another, as in, okay, so what happens is typically people become conscripted, then they learn some martial arts which are required for their military service. Typically the focus would have been on the sword and the spear. So the curved single-handed, sometimes the double-handed sword is called the Dao. Not the same, by the way, as the Dao, like the Dao from the Dao De Jing, just sounds a little bit different in Chinese. And the spear. Spear was the primary Chinese military weapon for many centuries.
It was the primary European military weapon for centuries too.
Yes.
Swords just got all the glory. Spears did all the actual work.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty much.
Although I would be inclined to believe that the Chinese used swords a tad more than the Romans and Greeks did.
I don't know. Okay, the Roman legionaries, their primary killing weapon was the gladius. They were getting close with their shields, and they would have this short stabbing sword that they would go stab, stab, stab. And that's, I think, how Romans killed, in actual like battle, and leaving aside the sort of siege engines and projectile weapons, their artillery basically.
So gladius and then the spatha later, right?
Well, the spatha was the cavalry sword.
Oh, okay.
As I understand it. Roman history is not my area of expertise, so I may be talking out of my ass. But as I understand it, I think most of the close quarters killing by Roman legionaries was done with the gladius. That's my understanding, anyway.
Notice how interesting that both the Greeks and the Romans had a very strong preference for relatively straight swords, whilst the Chinese, although for certain periods straight swords were almost exclusive in military use, during other periods, alongside the straight swords, and often more so than the straight swords, they had curved swords. And not necessarily, so there's a curved sword that looks like a katana, or a longer katana than Odachi. We spoke about the Miao Dao earlier. But the Dao is shorter, right? Dao could be...
It's basically a scimitar or a cutlass.
Exactly.
Call it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when you use a sword like that, it also changes the way you move. So you need rounder motions to take advantage of the curved blade, right? In order to slice in the way that it cuts. I do believe that the reason that the Chinese had a greater proclivity and preference for these types of blades has to do with their preference for circularity and round movements and concepts in their own culture. You see,
but those round movements, they don't work terribly well in line of battle.
It depends on whether they had shields, whether they did not have shields, what kind of opponents they're facing. Let us remember, for example, that the Chinese Yuan dynasty was founded by the Mongols. And when they were fighting the Mongols, again, I'm not a military expert, but I think that wouldn't have looked like the same as the Romans would fight the Germans.
Yeah, we're not talking about line of battle. We're talking about
exactly. So that
basically the Mongols fought closer to where the Germans fought, and the Romans came up with this system of but a lot like a Greek phalanx, where you have basically a line of shields and a line of spears behind them, and then you get in close and you stab, 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 and you're not fighting individually, you're fighting entirely as a unit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so but we should remember that a lot of the scimitars that we know of are somewhat more curved than the Chinese Dao.
Yeah.
So the Dao the curve is somewhere between a scimitar and a straight sword. So here's an
interesting thought for you, right? In European art, it is very rare. So we say before 1800, it is rare to see a man holding a curved sword, right? Almost invariably, if there's a curved sword, it's a picture of Judith who has just slain Holofernes, and she's always using almost always using a curved sword. Okay,
to slice the head off.
So there are lots of pictures of women holding a curved sword, and it's Judith slaying Holofernes. But it's sufficiently rare, and again, normally the only one example I can think of is I think it's on the floor of Siena Cathedral, where you have the slaughter of the innocents. So after Herod said, kill all the male children, of course the soldiers sent out to do that, they all have curved swords, because in European culture in that period.
Which period are we talking about?
We're talking about, should we say, 1200 to 1600?
Okay.
The people who carried curved swords were the Turks, and the Christians all had straight swords, right? And so it's quite difficult to find pictures of men holding men holding curved swords in art of that period. To the point that when I took my kids when they were little round various art galleries in Italy, for example, we spent 7 hours in the Vatican Museum. Oh my God, it was amazing. But I told them, I'll give you 10 cents for every time you find me a picture of a man holding a curved sword. And at the end of the day, I owed my children less than €1 each. Right? But then, of course, my youngest daughter found a pen and paper and drew a picture of a man holding a curved sword and said, that'll be 10 cents, please, Daddy.
That's a smart kid.
So that's a very smart kid, yeah.
That's a kid that's going to buy you a nice villa when you retire.
Well, maybe.
Good making money.
Maybe. So the whole curved sword, straight sword thing, there's a lot of cultural stuff going on there. I don't see it as a particularly necessarily a practical usage difference. I think it's more of this is how our culture perceives of the archetype that is sword.
I would also add that the curved swords became far more common in Chinese culture in the 18th, 19th, and maybe early 20th centuries due to their use in civilian life. So in civilian life, you don't hold a line of battle. And there was a big bodyguard culture in China, especially with respect to people having to send mail and treasury across the land. Because China, up until, I think it might have been up until the conquest of the nation by the communists and the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949, I think they did not have a national mail system.
Yeah,
so instead,
national mail system was invented by the British in the early 19th century, I think.
Okay,
with postage stamps and whatnot.
So you say that's the early 19th century. The Chinese probably only had a good one by the mid 20th century. So that's very late. So if you needed to send anything of value, then you would send it with by horse and cart. And if it was valuable, then people wanted to take it. So there
so
were
you had to have guards.
Yeah, bodyguard services guarding those caravans. Also, let us not forget the Silk Road. And the way you walk with the caravan is actually, because there aren't a lot of bodyguards typically, there are not 100 or 200 of them, maybe 5 or 10 or 15, and each of them is positioned at a different spot around that caravan. One is in front, one is in the back, one is on this side, one is on that side, one is in between, so they don't stand right next to one another.
Right. So we're not talking line of battle at all.
Exactly. And for these types of people, the sword of choice was often the Dao, the curved sword.
Sure. As authority. Also, just speaking of European curved swords, it occurred to me while we were speaking that when the Romans invaded Spain, they were very impressed with the weapon that the Spanish were using because it could actually cut through a legionary's helmet, right? And it was a curved sword that they adopted and called the Gladius Hispaniensis. And also, the sword that Alexander the Great is reputed to have used is a machaira, which is actually a similarly curved sword. It sort of curves forward like a kukri. And legend has it that the Gurkha kukri, the Gurkhas or the Nepalese people in that area, they started copying the swords that Alexander and his troops carried. So the whole curved sword thing, it's a bit more complicated than what we were saying before.
I would like to ask, how was it that the Spanish model was able to cut for a legionary's helmet? Was it the steel, the design, the curvedness?
I think it's the design. It's basically, if you think of it like a kukri, like a largish kukri, so it's got a forward curve. So basically the sword is kind of bent forwards, and it's got a reasonably deep belly. And also, the legionary's helmet is made of iron, right? It's not a tempered steel helmet. It's an iron helmet. So actually cutting through it isn't that difficult. And that's a critical thing. I mentioned earlier, like armor changed dramatically in the late 14th century. It was because sometime in the 1380s in Milan, they figured out how to make curved plates of steel that were both, that they could actually heat treat without losing the shape, so you could get it actually properly tempered so that it was both hard and tough. Previously, they could either make it hard or they could make it tough, and they couldn't make it. They couldn't make curved structures out of what we would think of as properly hardened steel, right? So that's where, armor really took off. So plate armor really took off in a big way in the 15th century because they figured out how to make this much, much more effective plate. So the Legionaries, it's a soft iron helmet. Cutting through it, it's not easy, but with the right sort of weapon, it'll go straight through.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, certainly swords can cut through iron. I've seen a demonstration of a modern-made Miao Dao, which is granted much higher standard, with modern purified steels and factories, etc. Cutting through steel pipes.
Yeah,
can definitely do it.
But it wouldn't cut through a hardened steel pipe. It was cut through an ordinary mild steel pipe. Sure, like you can use a pair of pliers to cut through the steel link on a steel link fence.
Yes.
If you're doing like secret ninja shit and cutting your way into some, I don't know, you're cutting your way in through a fence, like clip, no problem at all, because hardened steel just cuts right through softer steel, and you can harden a steel blade in a way that you couldn't in that time. You couldn't harden a curved surface.
Mm. I would like to go back on the topic of comparing the East Asian traditional martial arts with historical European martial arts and ask of you this. In East Asia, there was a very strong integration of either philosophy or religion, or both, into martial traditions. And that is a big part of what helped keep those traditions alive, because the Chinese have seen the martial arts as an expression of the rest of their culture. So, say there was a village. And I'll give the example of Chen village.
Just cut to the question. We're running late on time, so cut straight to your question.
Okay, so they preserved it as a cultural artifact because it had cultural, philosophical, sometimes religious value. So I wonder about, is there a movement or certain people who are interested in the integration of philosophy or perhaps even religion into historical European martial arts? Yes.
We do have, and they are generally very problematic. So, for example, there is a poisonous little subculture in historical European martial arts, note the European, that want to basically hark back to the original function of, like one of the reasons that knights were being trained in the 15th century was so they could go on crusades. Okay, so let's go to the Middle East and kill a bunch of people because we have different religious views, and there are some kind of religious nutcases who are basically, they want to train historical martial arts because it makes them think that they're a crusader.
But the enemy has AK-47s.
Well, duh. Okay, and other means of blowing you up too. I mean, it's horrible. But so there's that. There are people who are much less problematically, they have a philosophy, could be based on, I mean, there are references to, for example, Greek philosophers in some of the historical martial arts texts, most famously Angelo Vigiani's Los Scaramouche, published in 1575, where he explicitly refers to Aristotle's Physics, books 7 and 8, right? So there is a philosophical underpinning to the arts as they were then, but the philosophies that we live by now are completely different to the ones back then. There are some people who want to revive the philosophies and practice the arts accordingly. There are some people who have a philosophy and they want to express that through their art. And there are some people who do want to kind of revive the kind of, shall we say, problematic Christian aspect of some of these arts. So,
what was the intention of the founders of some of those styles? Did they express any religious or philosophical ideas?
No. Okay, if we talk about like like Lichtenauer is credited with saying something along the lines of "Young knight, learn to love God and honor women," and da 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 and da. So there's some sort of very general kind of you should be a good Christian and do this, that, and the other, right? But there isn't much in the way of specific philosophy, except I mean, in the 16th century we have at least some martial artists writing books who are coming from, I mean, Agrippa is the one that springs to mind, who was a mathematician and an architect, and his idea was recreating sword fighting from an entirely rational and mathematical perspective, right? This should work because it works mathematically, and that's a philosophy. But it's not really it's a philosophy of rationality rather than a philosophy as a system of ethics.
How about a social philosophy? Because in the East Asian arts, there's a whole, we're just talking about how hierarchy or family dynamics play a big role in how the schools actually function. Also a big role in how the typical politics are created.
I don't see it in the sources. So, I mean, Vadi, for example, in his 1480s De Arte Gladiatoria Vicandi, he mentions the sort of people who are fit to study the art, like kings and courtiers and princes and knights and dukes and barons and whatnot, and definitely no peasants allowed, right? They are only fit to carry heavy loads, he says, right? So there are some sort of like only people of a certain social class should be allowed to train these arts, right? Which is, of its time, that is quite unsurprising and not even particularly objectionable. It's just they were all massively classist back then because they were living in a kind of feudal society, right? So modern historical martial arts teachers absolutely have all sorts of social philosophies, right? This podcast, for instance, is entirely strategically, its goal is to promote women and other underrepresented demographics in historical martial arts. Right?
What are other underrepresented demographics?
Well, we have far fewer people of color, for example, than in America. You have a certain proportion of people who are, shall we say, not white, and they are not represented. Let's say, I don't have figures on this, but let's say that was 20% or 50% or whatever. Let's say 50%. We would expect 50% of people doing historical martial arts in America to be not white, but they're mostly white. Not all, but mostly. And the thing is,
people of color in the United States are about, I can't recall if it's 12 or 16% of the population.
And that also depends on what you consider of color.
Okay.
Right? And it varies widely by area too. Some areas are much more diverse.
Like Louisiana, right? Probably 40% or something.
Yeah, who knows? But the point is that I think that representation is helpful. And so finding people who are not middle-aged white men like me and bringing them onto my show and letting the wider historical martial arts community hear from those people, it also means that someone who is listening to the show who is not a middle-aged white dude sees people like themselves who are being sort of like in a martial arts class, the person that the instructor is demonstrating with is elevated above the other students in that moment, right? Same sort of thing. Bring somebody onto my show, I am indicating to the world that their opinion is worth listening to, and so affirming their value to the community. And so people like them can see people like them in that position and hopefully be encouraged to take up historical martial arts, or to, when they are inevitably discouraged by showing up to an event where it's all white men, go, well, hang on, maybe that's the event's problem, that's not me.
I see what you mean, yes.
Yeah, representation matters. So, and that is entirely due to my sort of social, it's a philosophical position, it's a social philosophical position. Right?
It's a noble take on it. I would agree. But could you describe perhaps other philosophies that are not very disagreeable that you came across with other teachers,
I know people who are explicitly trying to use historical martial arts, particularly knightly combat, to kind of as a venue to explore the virtues of knighthood, so the chivalry. Okay, but chivalry as it should have been, rather than perhaps chivalry as it actually was. So the virtues of knighthood include things like largesse, so being generous to people, giving money to charity and whatnot, and defending the weak, right? That sort of thing. So they are explicitly using their historical martial arts practice to promote the chivalric values.
Has there been teachers, who considered knighting students as equivalent of black belts and such?
Well, in the SCA, Society for Creative Anachronism, it's all about that kind of stuff. They have knights and dukes and lords and all sorts of things.
Okay, could you describe that society for a moment? I'm not familiar with it.
Honestly,
for everybody.
I am not a member. Many of my friends are members. And basically, it's called the Society for Creative Anachronism, which tells you pretty much everything you need to know about it. And it has ranks and hierarchies. It's all based on kind of, well, one of the strap lines for the society is the Middle Ages as they ought to have been. Right? And so, although it's not just, they don't just do combat stuff. They also do things like cookery and art and calligraphy and all sorts of other sort of historical skill sets. And some of them to an astonishingly high level. And they have within their culture, they have kingdoms run by kings and queens, and you become the king by winning the crown tournament. And that makes you king for like 6 months or a year until the next crown tournament. And they have all sorts of, I've never been part of it, so I don't have an in-depth knowledge of it. But basically, when you join the society, you usually get some sort of patron you would be like, they're the knight, you're the squire, and you do various things for them. And they have knighting ceremonies and that sort of thing. And that's very much about my read of it as an outsider who has many friends who are on the inside. My read of it is people aspire to a noble, fair culture where there are people who are respected because they have earned that respect through their actions. And they just like the idea of, there is this process I can go through where I can become a person who is respected for the actions they've done. It gives them the opportunity to do the actions that will gain them the respect, and then a formal recognition of those actions. And I have friends who have like orders of chivalry in the SCA, like the White Scarf, which at one time was the highest award for fencing you could get in any given kingdom. And it's like feudalism without the actual feudalism, in a sense.
Feudalism without the money.
Yeah, feudalism without the money and without the land ownership, and without also the permanence, right? The king's son is not a prince. If your dad happens to be a king in the SCA, because he's, and if you become king, I think like 3 times, you're made a duke for life. So let's say your dad is a duke. When he dies, you don't become a duke. You can't inherit the title. Yet. Right? Whereas in Britain, we have dukedoms, and if the duke dies, their eldest male relative, son ideally, becomes duke. Right?
I mean, if you were to think of it, the whole state of Israel is creative anachronism, right? We come in after 2,000 years in the diaspora, and we recreate what the state as we hope it ought to have been. So, for example, in biblical times, if there were witnesses and the council of elders was willing, you would stone those gay people. And nowadays in Tel Aviv, it's often called the gay capital of the world. So,
so yes, things have improved in certain ways. So, where actually are you in Israel?
I live in Ramat Gan, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv. It's not that far away.
Okay.
It's worth mentioning, by the way, it's almost surreal. You're having this casual, lovely, friendly talk, and we're in the midst of a war here, literally.
Yeah. Yes, I'm aware.
The sirens sound off several times a day, and then I have to go down to the shelter.
Wow.
So ordinarily, a person of my age would have been military reserve because I did serve.
Sure.
Unfortunately, when my service was finished, I requested to be in reserve. Typically, you don't even have to request; it's automatic. But since I was with the Israeli police force, they did not have the bureaucratic arrangement for people with my type of duties to be in reserve. So I was absolved. So instead, I do my reserve. I simply volunteer to treat people with traditional Chinese medicine as best I can to try to help, especially civilians who just fled from southern Israel.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, difficult times.
It's difficult, but you know what? Despite the great tragedy that is being experienced collectively right now in the region, often there is nothing quite like a war to unite a people, which is something the British had not experienced, fortunately, since the Second World War, but we Israelis have had several times over within the span of the past 75 years. And the nation is now, socially speaking, more united than ever. So this is a dynamic of war that I think is not actually discussed so much in the historical research on the wars of the past. People focus on the military campaigns, the weapons, the strategy, the politics, but how about it's not, what we often don't see written about are how did the common people behave.
It's becoming a lot more common. There's a lot more of that in the last 30, 40 years of historical research. And not least, the usual effect of bombing a city is to unite the city against the bombers, right? And they knew this already quite soon after the Second World War. And yet still, what the Americans did in Vietnam. And did it help? No, it didn't, right? It's one of those things. Everybody knows that bombing civilians doesn't work militarily, and yet they still do it because I guess they feel they have to be seen to be doing something.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on one's goal. The goal can be to eradicate the enemy. The goal might be to make more money for the military-industrial complex. Yeah. The goal might be to psychologically undermine the enemy to the point of less retaliation in the future.
But that doesn't work. That really doesn't work.
Well, you know what? I think, does it work in the short term, long term? Here in the Middle East, what we've seen is following military campaigns, there typically has been quiet on the military front, but it just did not last. The more severe the campaign, the longer it has lasted. So, for example, we haven't had much action on the Northern Front since the Second Lebanese War. They shoot a missile here and there, but overall, rather quiet. We haven't had any attacks coming from Egypt since the Yom Kippur War, the October War of 1973. Now, of course, we also signed a peace deal with them, but if politically speaking, in Egypt, I think the vibe, the kind of attitude towards Israel in Egypt is overwhelmingly negative within the majority of the population. And so it's a sort of a cold peace. There are a lot of tourists coming from Israel to visit Egypt. The Egyptians would be well behaved in that regard. Egyptians are coming to Israel, especially to Jerusalem, for worship, religious reasons, and we are well behaved towards them. There are a lot of tensions, but the war has sort of brought things to at least a temporary standstill. So I think it depends on whom your enemy is, how the magnitude of destruction, right? We see the Japanese are arming themselves now. Now they have a military once more. but they have been they've been quiet and pacifistic for several decades. Also, the Americans, I think the Americans did very different things with the invasions of, say, Vietnam and Japan. In Japan, there was a whole takeover of the entire Japanese educational system. And so the Japanese were, we could say convinced, but actually educationally coerced to think differently about their recent and future histories. In Vietnam, I don't think that the United States had done anything like this.
No.
And the results were very different. So I think there are more factors, civilian and cultural factors, beyond just the bombings themselves, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I mean, these are extremely complex phenomena. But actually, there are a couple of questions that I ask most of my guests. Let us get to those.
Yeah, sure.
The first is, what is the best idea you haven't acted on?
Best idea. Well, when I was young, my parents attempted to have me study all manner of musical instruments. And the one that I actually desired as a child was a piano. Okay. And I found myself almost tapping my fingers against the table as if I was playing piano throughout my childhood. So there's something in there, and I do have a musical ear, but I haven't quite picked an instrument, and certainly not the piano, throughout my life. And then I got into martial arts, and I'm so deeply occupied with the martial arts and writing books and Chinese medicine nowadays that I really do not have time to pick up an instrument. I'm engaged with too many other things. So I think I have some musical talent. I do know. What you've heard earlier is our elderly cat Ginger, whom we saved. She's 17, a little bit senile, so she meows too much.
Okay, but you don't actually have human children?
No, not yet.
No, okay. So, because I was thinking, because we have, my mum's a piano teacher, and so she insisted that, and she bought one of those electric pianos that actually has the proper pedals, and it actually has the right kind of piano feel. Doesn't take up a lot of space, but it's a great thing to have if you have a kid in the house, because they can learn to pick out tunes and what have you. And my younger daughter, she doesn't like having formal piano lessons, but she plays like Taylor Swift stuff. She kind of works it out herself on the piano because she's a massive Taylor Swift fan. So she works it all out herself on the piano, and just having the piano there creates the opportunity to play it. So I think if you put a piano in your house somewhere, you might actually find yourself 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there. When you need to maybe think about, you may need to let your subconscious work out the structure for the next book. Just, play Furley's or whatever, and da-da-da-da.
Could be that. Once this war is over, I'll have more time to think about such things.
Sure.
But in every person's life, there are certain points of divergency where you see that your life could have led you someplace very different. For example, I studied law, and my father had a medium-sized law office, which was very successful. He later merged it with one of the biggest law firms in the country. I could have gone on to be a very successful lawyer. I do have the skills for it, but that's not what my soul was calling up on me to do.
Okay, what kid grows up thinking, I could be a martial artist or a lawyer? I know, I'll be a lawyer.
Oh, well, I was thinking I would be a lawyer since I was 4 years old and told everybody I knew. Then I changed my mind around the age of 21, 22.
Okay, fair enough.
And there's also one moment when I was traveling. I was just on the plane on my way to my first trip in China to practice martial arts. And I was sitting in business class. So my father had lots of points with the airline. So he used the points to buy me a business class ticket to spoil me on my first trip, trip to China. Yeah, that's very kind of him. And next to me was sitting this fellow who was formerly an Air Force pilot in Israel, and was telling me these stories, and we really hit off, and we liked each other. And by the end of the flight, he was trying to convince me to come to Beijing and perhaps see if I would like to work for his company. And
Okay.
something about that conversation made it seem to me, and remember, I was a police investigator, interrogator, that this fellow might have been with, a certain agency.
Yes,
You know
understood.
what I mean?
Yeah.
So, and he actually gave me his card, and I was supposed to call, but and I was looking at that card every day and thinking, my God, this doesn't happen every day. This is a big opportunity. And Beijing is just a 3-hour drive from Tianjin, where I was practicing martial arts. But then I thought, hey, I'm here in China to practice martial arts, to become a martial arts teacher. Like, I'm not going to go into this James Bond kind of adventure, whatever that is. That's not, that's not what I signed up for. So I had to throw away the card so I wouldn't keep thinking about it,
Yeah. Okay. And my last question, somebody gives you like $1 million or whatever, a huge amount of money to improve historical martial arts, or in your case, perhaps Chinese martial arts worldwide. How would you spend the money?
Temple. Easy. Temple. But not like a temple on a mountaintop, which, by the way, I've been to in China. I've been to places like this. Magnificent. A big school which is what I'm going to set up anyway in the years to come. A school which is a martial arts school with a Chinese medicine clinic. That's the ultimate goal.
Okay.
I got into Chinese medicine to complement the martial side of what I practice, what I teach. Traditional Chinese medicine is the yin to the yang of traditional Chinese martial arts. They have a lot in common, and they work well together. And historically, many great teachers had martial arts schools, which are also Chinese medicine clinics. So that's what I aspire.
You may be interested to know, I owe my swordsmanship career to traditional Chinese medicine because I had hideous tendonitis in both wrists, and to the point that I was a cabinet maker at the time, that if I did any swordsmanship where you're banging swords together, my wrists would swell up and I would have difficulty working. Right. And doctors just basically told me, well, don't swing swords around. Like that's a solution. Right. And so I met this Kung Fu instructor by chance and happened to mention this. And he did this massage, which was unbelievably painful. And he taught me some basic exercises. And so long as I keep up my massage and exercise, my wrists are absolutely fine. And they are way better than they ever were before the problem occurred. And I mean, literally it went from, maybe I could do swords once a week if I'm really careful, to I could do swords as much as I like.
That's fantastic.
So I'm a huge fan of Chinese medicine, at least for some things.
So he basically treated you primarily with Tuina, Chinese medical massage, right?
Yeah, and I have like I still get this sort of herbal medicine stuff that kind of you splash on.
Diadajo it's called.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Diadajo translates as hitful medicine or hitful wine. Yeah. And these are herbal formulas that are made as alcoholic tinctures you rub into your skin in affected areas. It can be for all kinds of conditions, but usually for orthopedic conditions.
Yeah. That's exactly what we use it for.
That's really excellent.
Yeah. So so you're going to use this millions of dollars to build your temple. Where would you put it?
Oh, so I just nicknamed it a temple. Of course, it would be more so, like,
So your martial arts center. Yeah.
I would put it in probably my city, somewhere close to where I live. Yeah.
Okay.
I think there isn't. If you. There's two modes of thought with the Chinese monk tradition. So a lot of monks dwell in the monasteries for the specific reason that in a monastery you have a lifestyle that allows you a lot of time to practice your religion, your meditation, everything else you want to work through, whether it's martial arts or other things. But there are actually monastic traditions that say, the highest level of being a monk is living as a monk amongst the people.
Right.
So living
it's harder.
Yeah, a life that externally appears perfectly ordinary, but within your home and within your own little temple that you built or wherever, you have this very deep religious existence, but you still live among the people and you fulfill your role both as a monk and as a human being, a part of civilization, society. So at this stage in my life, I feel actually more comfortable living amongst the people and not. I don't have any desires to retreat into the mountains or anything like that.
Yeah. Fair enough. Well, good. I'm not a fan of martial arts schools that hide away where you can't find them. There we go. So we are well over time. So let's wrap it up. I'll cut this little bit out. So thanks so much for joining me today, Jonathan. It's been lovely to meet you.
Thank you so very much, Guy, for having me and hosting me. I think we had a splendid, very educational conversation for the both of us.